So we just heard from Tom Burton on the fundamentals of cybersecurity, and what I want to do next is really drill down into the role of CISO. So to that end, I'm delighted to be joined by Marius here, who is by day a CISO and by night a virtual CISO. He's got his own podcast on cybersecurity called Cyber Diaries, which I'd strongly recommend. And he also sits on the advisory board for a number of cyber vendors. And then in the little spare time he has beyond that, he's a keen sim racer. So Marius, welcome. So Marius, I'm keen just to jump straight in and understand a little bit more the role of the CISO, the Chief Information Security Officer. And I think this is a really interesting role for lots of us, because there's a sort of non-technical understanding of what the CISO should be. And then there's the CISO's understanding of what the CISO should be. So it'd be great if you could help us understand really what the role of CISO does involve.
Yeah, I think there's very contrasting views, I think, that really came out over the last week. Some of the posts that I mentioned on LinkedIn that really, I think, grasped what CISOs or other CISOs believe what we should be doing and what is the perspective of, business leadership. And, we are always, most of the time we are thinking that we are, hired to protect the business, prevent revenue loss and increase business resilience against cyber threats. But the point that sometimes I think I'm making is that most businesses view CISOs still as a person who needs to be, or whose name needs to be on cyber insurance, someone who's, needs to be on client-facing documents just because we had one, and, essentially becomes that person who sometimes is neglected from budgetary point of view, from, hiring the team point of view, and actually having enough tools to increase that resilience, and then eventually is being blamed when things go wrong. So I think the main thing what we need to do is, and we need to do a lot of work in educating business leaders that we're not there to necessarily, stop bad things from happening. They're going to happen, but we are there to decrease the chances of bad things happening. We are there to prevent revenue loss, and we are essentially trying to increase the ROI of the business and grow the business. And I think, the skills of the CISO changed over the last year. I always say, to those who are trying to enter the CISO field, is that your technical acumen gets you in through the door, but the soft skills, the influence, the storytelling, your ability to get your point across and translate the technical terms to the board are the ones that's going to keep you in the job and elevate your career forward. So I always say now, like, political navigation across the board and storytelling skills are really the ones that are going to differentiate you from all the rest of them.
So are you saying that many CISOs are being set up to fail from the start because of the way that their role has been defined and because of where it sits in the organization? Or are you saying that many CISOs don't come equipped with all of the skills that they need to be effective in that role?
I think there's a bit of blame probably on both of the sides, but I think mostly what my post said, and I think the resonating feedback was that CISOs are having all of the accountability without the support that is needed to achieve what they're trying to achieve. And I think that's a big problem. And secondly as well, I think the problem we have nowadays is there is no prescribed path to becoming a CISO. There is no courses. I know you can do CISP or CISM or these courses, but again, there's another post which again resonated with loads of people, that these certifications no way, shape or form prepare you to becoming a CISO, because they're still geared towards technical cyber risk management and some of the stuff that does not really translate in the boardroom cyber risk reporting scale. But yes, I think most of them are being set up to fail, but there are also CISOs, who are struggling to acquire and have the skills that they need in order to gain that feedback, gain that support, and translate. There are still CISOs who are potentially, reporting vulnerability numbers to the board. They do not understand, what these numbers mean. We need to talk about numbers, translating cyber risk into, instead of quantity, qualitative analysis, and translate that into dollars and pounds.
So, can I expand on that then? Because if we take with the advent of agentic services and the advent of AI, and the role of a CISO traditionally has always sat within a technical vertical stack within an organisational structure.
Yeah.
Is that the right place for a CISO to be given? That actually, if you are to become a good storyteller, and you are to drive not just governance, but also drive change and adoption and education throughout a business, should a CISO sit in a more of an operational role, paired with a COO, or even, as Mark Humphrey said in the previous one, actually maybe under a CPO?
Or maybe they should be a direct report into the chief exec.
Chief exec.
For certain types of business that have got a high dependency on technology, should they be directly into the chief exec and not perhaps buried under the CIO?
I think most of the time the goal is to report to the CEO, because we always have, there's always a conflict of interest, because CIO goal is always to increase availability, where you are, directly into that CIA triad, you are an opposing views. So there's always problem. And especially if your views are reported by another exec into the board, they can always be skewed based on their agenda. And I always say nowadays, CISO has an unprecedented chance to get that board seat, while not necessarily, being scared of AI, but actually leading the AI adoption and showcasing the business how we can adopt AI with security in mind and breaking the barriers. And then, you gain trust and support and showcasing, that AI is there to help. I think that's why you can see, like, the numbers tells us now that out of FTSE 500 companies who are, trying to implement AI, only about 5% of them reach production because they are struggling to get there.
So Marius, we've talked about reporting line, that, perhaps the gold standard, if you like, is that the CISO reports directly into the CEO because it gives them the sort of independence and the authority. If you're writing your perfect mandate for a CISO, what else goes on there to describe what accountabilities they have and what resources they have at their disposal?
I think ultimately is the understanding. Now, the regulation is shaping, and obviously at the end of the day, CEO and the business is accountable for cybersecurity. They, however, delegate the responsibility of running the cyber program to the CISO. And we need understanding about, and I think sometimes that CISO needs to showcase this, but I always say about, cybersecurity has a way to enable business growth and bring in more revenue, but it's about the storytelling and those aspects of showcasing how that could happen. I always say, for example, similar thing, if you go and talk to salespeople, now, if you try to acquire new clients, most of the questions come, do you have SOC 2? Do you have security controls? Do you have cybersecurity program? You leading the SOC 2 program potentially brings more revenue because you can gain more clients and close the sales quicker. So if you lead with that story, you can sell the SOC 2 and add on any initiatives that helps you, secure the organization and move it forward. So it's about understanding those narratives and leading the executives down that path. I think it's about understanding and talking about numbers. I always say, whenever you translate the numbers, it makes it easy, because if you have a business that has a ransomware risk of £5 million and you have a control that costs, say, 100K to reduce that risk from 5 million to 500,000, that's a very easy conversation to have. But if you go to the board and say, we got ransomware risk of 16 on 5x5 matrix, they don't have a clue what that means to them. So it's about translation, and it's about talking about monetary values and talking about the risk appetite and the risk they're willing to take on.
So you mentioned earlier that you think most CISOs grow into the role from a technology start point. But listening to you there, it sounds like there's a lot of other languages that they need to speak. They need to be able to talk about how do they reinforce the sales team in terms of what their USPs are to the market? How do they speak to the CFO in terms of the financial implications? How do they speak to the chief people officers, perhaps, about how to equip the teams to deal with spear phishing attacks? So how can CISOs grow those other skills alongside their technology skills on the way to becoming CISOs?
Oh, I think there's obviously, you have to look at your personal skills and elevate them. I think the one thing that, when I went into a CISO role, the first thing I very quickly realized that all of the technical books that I read before need to go and give way for stuff like, I read amazing book by a lead FBI negotiator about influence. I read the book about the smartest person in the room. I read the book about empathy. So all of these, skills and knowledge stacks up and helps you. But I think ultimately, you try and be helpful. What we always talk about, first 90 days in your role, what do you do? Well, you're trying to go around the room. You talk to CFO, you talk to COO, trying to understand their problems and how technology and your technical ability can help solve the problems. So then you can tie those initiatives and help people. Keith Price, who's a CISO from National Highways, he perfectly said, my first couple of weeks is to meet everyone and offer them help and advice, because that means when I help people, they're likely to return the favor. So when I present security initiatives in front of the board, I have a number of supporters that are already gained who are willing to support my story, my initiatives, and my goals. So I think that's a very important problem. It's about learning the people's personalities, how you need to talk to each other, because every single person will have their own quirks. You need to understand how CFO wants to be talked to, how COO wants to be talked to, how the CIO is, or any other executives want to hear what is their biggest pain point and what are the biggest problems that they're trying to solve, and how you can help with security to help them, essentially.
And it sounds like the onus, in your view, is also on those other chiefs to reach out to the CISO to help them understand the different agendas around the business and to perhaps coach them into being able to speak to those.
Yeah, exactly. I think it's for example, that's why sometimes I talk. People who are trying to change their careers and go to cybersecurity, I think teachers are great people who go into cybersecurity because they learned from day one how to talk to a 7-year-old. And sometimes you need to translate your technical initiative, your technical tool, when you talk to executive like he's a 7-year-old, because they do not understand that technical language. And that's a great skill to have.
So just bringing it back to, especially around, just bringing it back to AI and automation, and CISO is currently where they sit, right, which is very much hidden under the technical office, right, or let's call it the CTO office, for example. With businesses going out, because most CISOs I've met, and actually, Marius, you're very different to a lot of CISOs I've met, not just because of the size, but actually because you are a storyteller. But a lot of CISOs I've interacted with are extremely technical.
Yep.
Started as SOC analysts, and then actually what they really then end up becoming isn't what you're describing. What they're becoming is someone who walks around the business with a clipboard, almost like a health and safety officer, right? And actually they become extremely restrictive to a lot of businesses, or a thorn for a lot of people.
Yes.
And I've even started to hear rumors around, let's just create an agent that can look at our gap analysis, right? They can take all of our controls and all our technical, and actually we can bundle it all into an agent, and then he can just give us a report at the end of the day. For those type of CISOs that do exist out in the wild, what would be your advice to them?
I think the problem is, and I've seen and heard those CISOs who are, essentially be, too technical, and sometimes are become sort of, protectors of their realm and trying to, and if anyone's trying to challenge them, they, become sort of micromanaging teams and things like that. There's a lot of bad stigma in that space. And I think the problem is you have to always understand that when you're becoming not necessarily department of no, but when you're blocking specific business initiatives for the sake of security, you very quickly are on a path where you are no longer listened to. And I know we hear CISOs crying out that their voice is not heard, but sometimes that's their own fault. And I always say, for example, I'll give you a couple of examples. When we talk about automation and technology, I think you as a security, you can create so much more benefit to the business outside of just security. So I have a guy who does a lot of work with automation, with power apps and stuff like that. And sometimes I say to him, go around the business and see what problems you can solve for other departments, because that shines a good light to security. We're doing work outside of security, but we're helping the business to solve tasks, to save time, to increase efficiency, which means that this correlates to what we're trying to do with security, and it gains support across other departments. These people are praising our praises because we're willing to help the business. And I think sometimes that's what you need to do. You need to go outside of the box and think how AI and agentic, workflows can help the business. You have that knowledge sometimes in security function, so you can help the business and therefore unlock the roadblocks in your security program that you might have.
It's spot on.
So we were chatting to Tom a little bit earlier about how AI adoption starts to affect the cybersecurity posture. We talked a bit about how AI was increasing the volume and effectiveness of external threats coming in, and we're also talking a bit about how adoption of AI and sometimes shadow AI internally was increasing the vulnerability. Could you give us your view on how AI affects your posture and how practically this can be managed by companies so that they balance the risk that we're talking about, but also some of the opportunity that's undoubtedly there?
Yeah, I think the one thing that really, first of all, stands out is that whenever we talked about anything, previously technological-wise, the adoption of it was quite straightforward, because you can just slap around some security controls on it, and it makes our life quite easy. Whenever we talk about AI, and that's why I say sometimes it's difficult to solve this problem, because the protection of AI no longer sits just within the security. You have ethical considerations, you have bias consideration, there are legal and regulatory requirements that, all of a sudden the governance framework and the governance of AI becomes such a, it's a business-wide issue and it's no longer sits just within security. So it requires a lot more collaboration and a lot more understanding. And I think, that education gap that we currently have is quite wide. And I think, the problem I see pretty much constantly is executives read news and they see that AI can do in their mind miracles. So therefore we are blindly running towards AI without understanding the risks and difficulties in AI adoption. And I think the biggest problem sometimes I see is that they are leading into building AI instead of adopting AI tools. And the hardest part is getting ROI when you're trying to build your own AI, because people want AI, but they don't understand what they're trying to solve even with AI. And the problem is when you see the running costs of AI, it's exorbitantly expensive. And normally, if you're just doing some little efficiency tasks, you're not even close to getting ROI from it. Not even remotely close. And I think that's where we need more education to the boards to understand that AI is not going to be all of the problem solver. It's great at handling vast amounts of data and giving you sort of summarizations and guidance, but we still need human intelligence in some tasks. Well, I always say, for example, we can lean into security, but in security operations centers, AI is great to replacing tier 1 SOC analysts. And I always say, I think a lot of people are scared of it, but I encourage it. And one of the videos I posted is received tremendous feedback, because I say tier one, sort of level one SOC analyst work that they're doing, it's pain breaking, looking at hundreds of incidents per day, and leads to a burnout. If we can eliminate that and give people to do more interesting, more human intelligence work and solving more interesting incidents, we're removing the potential burnout and solving that, low level manual work. I think that's great benefit. Obviously, raises a bit of the bar of of entry level into the SOC, but I think it's helping the SOC as well.
That's really interesting. So could you unpack a little bit more for us how AI can be used within companies to improve detection and response of any incidents? Just give us a few examples of the sorts of tools and methods.
Well, I think AI is great. Again, great at sifting through vast amounts of data. We see nowadays how organizations, have gigabytes, sometimes terabytes worth of logs in a day. Now, spotting anomalies, it's a hard task. So AI is great at learning the patterns, and we can become, I was recently at a non-human identity conference, and we talked a lot about identity. But for example, normally we have an identity space, we have conditional access policies, but they are written sort of predetermined and they are very rigid. With the help of AI, we can change and mold them sort of in real time. So AI not necessarily will understand business context, but it can sift through and create patterns of understanding, this person normally does not log into this application at 1 a.m. Let's create an alert. Let's create an MFA challenge. Let's look at their, device fingerprint. Let's scan their device against malware and things like that. So AI can do all of those tasks to prevent potential malicious, entry points in your organization, because it learns the patterns. It can learn every single user pattern and do that in real time, which before wasn't really possible because everything was very rigid.
So can I ask a question there? Because you touched on something really interesting, which was identity.
Yep.
I talked to a lot of people, and actually identity as a definition changes in an organization when you have effectively, the saying comes up a lot, which is a synthetic workforce, right? You have autonomous agents running around, well, not running around, but you know what I mean. Unattended attended agents, which are usually controlled through some trick and mechanism, usually a human in the loop. And then you have what I'll call grey AI at this point, which is, people bring in N8N in, or some type of Zapier integration where they've got their own GPT model or some deep logic server running, and then they're using their own integration into their business. For a CISO to educate and to really understand how to get ahead of this sprawl across a business, is understanding identity, or digital identity politics, I'll call it for now, something that should be explored more fundamentally.
Definitely. I think especially, when I just mentioned, non-human identities, the latest data suggests that nowadays in modern organizations, we have 92 non-human identities per one human identity. So you have, API keys, machine credentials, and all of that. The sprawl is becoming crazy, and when you say you got introducing AI agents and things like that, there are plethora of identities, and any of them that has highly privileged access being exposed brings a great risk. So how do we manage and how do we protect that? And also, I think the biggest problem is here now, how do we educate the users? Because now we're talking about especially shadow, because people are, in their workspaces just playing around, building agents, and all of a sudden, you connect an enterprise application to it and give admin access to one of these agents, and all of a sudden, it lands in your public-facing private GitHub.
So the challenge you're saying is you watch the Anthropic, perfect example of where there was one agent He was an agent telling another agent, telling another agent, telling another agent. There's a chain link. It wasn't one person saying that agent privilege access, so I do this. It was actually an entire sequence that happened that got around with certain vetting and with own security and governance, right? Yeah. Because it was actually going down to the macro or micro level. It's structured where actually they look at identity in a different way, and in your business, you know, you can tell sabotage or a human, right? Actually, but self-employed, you could have a sheet access, or you could have an agent or an AI platform that you're developing on your own. You know, and they're free personality edges. There's all sorts out there now that people like to bring in and use, or even voice agents, right? That have like AI API access to your CRM system, payment processing, purchasing systems. So you could manipulate using their voice through micro instructions, right? Where does the education begin?
I think the biggest problem is, and that's why, you know, I love the idea, you know, all of this new vibe coding and all of that, you know, building your own apps. But the problem is, we are kind of bypassing the guardrails and understanding of things. Because yes, you can use AI to build an application, but you still need to explicitly understand and have knowledge around security, around resilience. You know, there was an article that went around the news where AI agent overnight deleted production database and your app was gone. Now, the problem is, yes, you can build an app, but you need to have an understanding that you need to have a replica of your production database. You need to have specific checks and balances that should this agent do something, you can reverse it or you can fix it and you don't lose all of the customer data. Now, this database that was deleted, all of the customer data, everything was gone, and you had no, you know, checks and balances. So I think the biggest problem is that we are giving the power to these people to build stuff, but they don't understand the basics. And I think that's where the problem is. There was a great post somebody said, and I was laughing at it. It said something along the lines, in 2026, 50% of the code will be written by AI. In 2027, 100% of the code will be written by AI. In 2028, we're going to hire developers to fix the crappy AI code that was built last year.
Yeah, I can picture that.
So if you're an exec looking at your business and you're not a CISO, I think it's a very bewildering thing to look at, because there's lots of technical detail in there and lots of risks that you need to understand in the detail of the operations that you're not necessarily aware of. So how, as a non-technical CXO, can you recognize whether you've got good cybersecurity practice in place?
Well, I think it's about you having an honest conversation with CISO and you know, asking the right questions in order to ascertain.
Those questions are?
Those questions are, you know, talking about cyber posture and what are the main cyber risks that we currently have, but translating all of that in a monetary value. You know, the thing is, I think one of the posts I made before as well, one of the hardest questions that you get asked from executive when you are stopped in a corridor is, are we secure? Because you can never say yes. We are always undertaking certain level of risk, but your goal as a CISO is to make sure that we are undertaking only the risk that business is willing to accept. And you have to have a plans for the risks that you are not willing to accept. And that's the thing, is your goal is to translate to the CEO and to the board that what risks do we have? What are their potential value if they materialize? And what do we do about them?
If I'm a CEO or a chairman or an investor, what is my top checklist of controls that I'm looking for to get comfort they're in place and therefore my risk is appropriately managed?
I think that the thing is, it will be dependent on every single organization. And I don't think, you know, you can prescribe anything, because I always kind of very hesitant when people say, oh, you have to have these controls. I think every single control is business dependent and based on your specific risk profile, because it will vary vastly between different organizations, between different maturity size of the businesses, and depends on what you are doing as a business. But there are good starting points. You know, you got obviously NIST, CSF, you got CIS top 18 controls and things like that. So you need to have an honest conversation with your board and understand where do they want to be and how comfortable they are of taking some of the risks that we are, we have in the organization.
So I guess you end up responding to a fair number of breaches by virtue of your role. When you look at those breaches, what are the patterns and the common themes you see around what originally caused those breaches? What are the...
I think there are a couple of things. Sometimes it's just human error. It's inevitable that, I always say, take for example, phishing. Now, if someone's working in accounts payable, they receive 500 emails probably per day, and their goal is to open in emails, look at, PDFs and things like that. So expecting them to never click on a link is ludicrous and crazy. But you have to be, as an organization, you have to build enough cyber resilience that when one single thing fails, it doesn't become catastrophic. That's why we build defense in depth. So, but yeah, human error is one thing. And secondly is sometimes it's just inevitable. I always say, and I think we don't talk enough about it. When I used to work back in the day in different organizations, we talked a lot about cyber defense matched to threat sophistication. Now, if I'm a small organization, I would never be able to build a cyber program to defend against Chinese state hackers, because that cost will, make us bankrupt. So you normally build a program based on level of threat sophistication that you are willing to protect against. And sometimes you will get hit. There's zero-day attacks. There are very sophisticated hackers that, maybe only very, very big organizations with thousands of teams in cyber teams and billions in budget can protect against. But there are organizations where, if the elite level nation state comes knocking, you can't do much about it.
Okay, so if you're at the smaller end of the mid-market and you don't necessarily have the scale and the resources to have your own dedicated cybersecurity function or your own CISO, how can they best manage their cyber risk? I guess you can talk about a virtual CISO, but can you talk us about that?
Yeah, I think there's always I'm always very worried about organizations who have no cyber expertise whatsoever. They might have one IT guy who's managing it all, and virtual CISO is a great way to tap in to a knowledge that will help you to put checks and balances, because you don't necessarily need a sophisticated cyber program, but you need some certain basics. And I see this time and time again, when organizations just go to a vendor, sometimes they're being sold everything under the sun without having that CISO expertise and guidance to tell them what they need to do. Because the goal is, I always say, especially if you are a smaller sort of mom and pop shop or smaller SMB sort of type of business, you don't necessarily need to completely shore up and be 100% secure. But you need to be secure enough that the threat actor, instead of knocking on your door, will go on someone else's door. And you need knowledge and guidance to do that. Because sometimes, you just need to start with simple things like MFA, just deploying EDR, XDR, and having email gateway security. And that might be enough for the level of sophistication that you might have in your organization. But it's just about understanding how to deploy these tools, how to configure, and how to get the best out of them. You need guidance, help, and support, essentially.
So talk us through in practice how the role of a vCISO works, and how does it differ from having your own full time?
Well, I think as a vCISO, normally you are dealing with a number of organizations, and sometimes it's harder because obviously you're constantly doing context switching. But your goal is not necessarily to, to build a super sophisticated cyber program or build the cyber teams. Sometimes it's just to advise and understand where the business is going. Because, I mentioned before, cyber is definitely a way to also unlock new revenue streams. If you increase compliance, if you get these certificates, if you meet the regulatory needs to avoid fines, some of these things sometimes business executives don't even think about. So it's about guiding them and showing how we can get more customers, how we can gain customer trust, how we can unlock new revenue streams by being compliant with the new security standards that prevents entering, for example, if you're smaller businesses, you might be prevented to landing deals with enterprises because they won't work unless you have SOC 2. So all of these things can potentially lead down the path where your spend in cybersecurity gives you back X amount of multiples back by landing new deals with other clients.
So if you're wrapping up all of these points, what advice would you give to a CEO of a mid-sized firm, and what do you think their biggest blind spots are around cyber right now?
I think the biggest blind spots are that most businesses still believe that they are small enough to be attacked, or why would they be attacked? But if you're making any amount of money, you are a target. If you got data, you are a target. If you got credit card data, healthcare data especially, you are a target. And all of these points can make threat actors to make money. So you are definitely a target. So you need to find help and advice and seek experienced professional guidance in understanding of what your current posture is and where the biggest gaps are and how you can solve them and essentially reduce the cyber risk that you're currently facing.
Thanks, Marius. Coffee beats?
I was trying to think of something provocative then, but I was like, I don't want you coming at me. So, no. If you could, with AI and automation, and actually in a lot of cases, the pursuit of value creation.
Yep.
What would be your hot take, or just a thought that you'd want to put out into the wild that a board or an executive leadership team should consider when removing all the guardrails? Because they are, in a lot of instances. What would be your one thing that you would say to them? Not to protect, obviously, the whole business, because when they do remove the guardrails, they're taking that calculated risk, right? But what would be the one thing that you would want them to at least
I think you need to have space to experiment. You need to sort of create, I suggested in my, in a number of businesses, you need to sort of sometimes even probably take a plunge and hire AI engineer or that kind of level person who can go around the business and experiment and play around and see where efficiency gains could be made from tooling, from, whether it's process, minding and understanding where, savings could be made with automation, what tools could be plugged in to reap the rewards. And not necessarily, as I say, not necessarily going down the path of building, but actually acquiring and seeing what could be made. Because, sometimes I see this, the problem is that we are given a task or a task of solving these problems to someone who doesn't know what they're doing. And, that's where things kind of fall by the wayside. So I think especially, as I said before, you are a security professional, you have knowledge to do that and help business do that. And, if you can save money to the business, chances are you can get a cut of the savings and spend on your security program. I had a meeting with a person a couple of weeks ago, and actually they showed a great example. There are tools now who can plug into your cloud, a FinOps tool, who can optimize your cloud usage and give you anywhere from 10 to 20% savings on your cloud spend, which normally says whenever we have problems with people buying security tools, we plug in this FinOps tool that saves you, say, 100 grand a year, and then you buy a tool for half of that for 50 grand. So you win, the business wins, everyone wins.
So just quickly then, if you are going to remove the guardrails, and it's funny enough that we're sitting in UiPath's offices, right?
Yeah.
To leverage a more off-the-shelf platform, because it will come an enterprise or an access and off-the-shelf platform that has a lot of these guardrails built in, has a lot of these controls that has been tried and tested and around for a long time, rather than building your own and playing around in your own on your live systems with your own, with some level of ignorance and naivety, really. Would you say that would be a smarter and faster time to value for most business?
I think so, especially I think on a smaller sort of scale businesses, because as I mentioned before, running your own sort of AI in any shape or form, especially if you require any sort of training, the costs are astronomical and very few businesses can afford that. But now on the flip side, yes, you can play around with agents and stuff like that. You just need to be mindful of who is able to experiment, what is their level of skill and knowledge, and then you need to think about in the new world, what tools do you need that? Because when we go into the world now, there are tools now who can scan your agentic flows and detect vulnerabilities, misconfigurations, identity sprawl. You need to be prepared for that. You can't go in blind expecting that nothing bad's going to happen.